The development of The Outer Worlds 2 took place during a rather complex and interesting phase for Obsidian Entertainment, the studio responsible. The project began shortly after the release of the first game in 2019, but entered full development about 2 years later, at a time when the team was still dealing with the echoes of the pandemic and internal changes. Tim Kaine, a legendary figure who co-directed the first game and has a strong history in RPGs with Fallout, participated as a creative consultant, although he was no longer an integral part of the studio. It's noteworthy that the team for the second game largely consisted of members from the original team, including programming and direction leads, thus continuing the spirit and vision of the first game, but with new learning and experience. One of the most personal and curious aspects of this production is that it occurred while the studio was immersed in its ownership by Microsoft, a corporate giant that ended up acquiring Obsidian in 2018. This created an even greater irony because The Outer Worlds deals precisely with the negative consequences and manipulations of mega-corporations in its fictional universe. Leonard Boyarsky, creative director and co-creator, recalls what a shock it was for the team to be developing a game with a strong critique of this type of power, while at the same time working under the baton of an industry giant. Despite this situation did not harm creative freedom, which reflects Microsoft's confidence in the studio and its desire to maintain the authenticity and critical tone that define the franchise. In terms of design and ambition, The Outer Worlds 2 was conceived to be a larger and deeper game than its predecessor. The team committed to delivering much larger areas, more complex RPG systems, and an improvement in combat that encompassed not only shooting, but also character movement and abilities. They wanted to correct limitations seen in the first game, where the relatively short duration, 20 to 30 hours, prevented greater diversity in outcomes and in the influence of the player's decisions. This shows a maturation of the studio in an attempt to create a broader, more responsive RPG full of possibilities that reflect the player's choices. From an internal development perspective, the studio went through a critical period during the first years of the pandemic, even considering suspending the project to focus on other games. This phase, described by President Fergus Urquhart, was a time of difficulties and low productivity, which even left the studio kind of bad for almost a year and a half. However, the team managed to reorganize and maintain their commitment to the schedules, demonstrating an important resilience for such an ambitious development. This overcoming highlights the passion and professionalism that the team has for the franchise and for the RPG genre. Another element that marked this process was the collaboration and learning from other studios under the Xbox Game Studios umbrella. The development team actively sought to exchange experiences on mocap, performance capture, and various mechanics, such as improving gunplay by talking with teams from Ninja Theory, Double Fine, Halo Studios, and even Kojima Productions. This network of support and exchange of external knowledge reinforces the open and collaborative development environment, something that is often overlooked in the industry but can result in more polished and innovative games. Furthermore, Obsidian faced the challenge of solving classic problems that have plagued RPGs for decades, as expressed by Tim Kaine, who mentioned having found solutions to design dilemmas faced since the original Fallout, more than 25 years ago. This reinforces the idea that The Outer Worlds 2 is not just a sequel, but an evolution based on much reflection and the studio's historical experience with the RPG genre. Knowing that the team focused on solving these old issues offers an interesting expectation for players seeking a more coherent and engaging RPG. This entire journey seems to me a reflection of Obsidian's passion for telling stories with depth and complexity. It is a studio that has already gone through crises, cancellations, and changes, but has never lost the will to innovate and deliver meaningful experiences. The turbulent development, the pressure of the Microsoft acquisition, the pandemic, and the desire to correct flaws from the first game show an admirable commitment. Even facing ironies and challenges, they seem to have embraced the project with the intention of creating something truly special, not only for fans of action RPGs, but for those who value rich worlds, impactful decision-making, and a good dose of social criticism. The Outer Worlds 2 brings as the central point of its story a premise that, since the original game, has already awakened a special admiration in me. The contrast and conflict between human colonization, guided by corporations, and the individual's search for meaning and survival. This time, the narrative unfolds in a completely new star system, the Arcadia system, where the player takes on the role of an agent from the Earth Directorate. This character's role is to investigate mysterious rifts that threaten to destroy the entire colony and the galaxy. And this mission starts with the foot on the gas. bringing a plot that mixes action with political intrigue and deep moral challenges. The setting in Arcadia is one of the points that most caught my attention. Unlike the more closed and contained universe of Halcyon from the first game, here we have an expanded universe full of new factions, technologies like the skip drive, and an atmosphere that promises to blend mystery with the typical satire and social criticism that characterizes Obsidian. My personal expectation is that this rich setting, which brings a kind of futuristic Western space, will make us feel part of an epic adventure, but also allow for that strong immersion in a living and opinionated world, where each choice of loyalty to a faction can change the course of the story. Speaking of the story and narrative structure, The Outer Worlds 2 maintains what made its predecessor so praised, the dialogue tree system that directly influences the plot. This delivers a game dynamic that favors choices and consequences. And personally, I really dig this feature because it makes the experience vibrant and very personal. The player is not just going through a story, but shaping the destiny of the colony and even the people around them in a way that makes each decision feel much more impactful than just a cold yes or no in the script. The beginning of the story relies on a classic but effective point: investigation. The protagonist begins by investigating the devastating rifts, a point that I found not only a narrative hook, but also a rich opportunity to explore complex themes such as the consequences of technological advancement and the imbalances in a system dominated by corporations. I have a personal opinion that these rifts are a metaphor for the instability of the system itself, showing that even seemingly solid structures, be they political or social, have their weaknesses, and that the future depends on the ability to deal with this intelligently and audaciously. Something I also like to see is the growth in the complexity of the team and the antagonists. Unlike the previous game, where the companions already had striking personalities, here there is a promise of a new crew, which opens up space for new layers of interpersonal narrative. This excites me, as I think good stories are those that not only deliver a cool world but also create convincing relationships, full of tension, humor, and even internal conflicts that impact the unfolding of the journey. The inclusion of the ability to switch between first and third-person perspectives, something the first title did not allow outside of specific scenes, also seems to me a detail that will influence how the story is experienced by the player. This design decision can make a huge difference in the way narrative moments are absorbed. After all, the point of view greatly influences immersion and the sense of being the protagonist. I particularly think that this alternation can make it more accessible for different playstyles and more exciting in key scenes. I feel that The Outer Worlds 2 carries that energy of a sequel that honors the original, but without fear of reinventing itself. The story seems not only to expand the universe, but also to deepen the kind of questioning and social criticism that excites me in games that not only entertain, but also make you think. I can't wait to see how the moral choices and the plot development will impact the unfolding of events, hoping that the game maintains that delicate balance between acid humor and existential tension that marked the first title as one of my favorite RPGs. Exciting in key scenes. I feel that The Outer Worlds 2 carries that energy of a sequel that honors the original, but without fear of reinventing itself. The story seems not only to expand the universe, but also to deepen the kind of questioning and social criticism that excites me in games that not only entertain, but also make you think. I can't wait to see how the moral choices and the plot development will impact the unfolding of events, hoping that the game maintains that delicate balance between acid humor and existential tension that marked the first title as one of my favorite RPGs. The Outer Worlds 2 arrives with a noticeable visual leap compared to its predecessor, but what stands out the most is the choice of a graphic style that does not seek photorealism, but rather a striking and vibrant artistic identity. This aesthetic decision is a high point for me, as it creates a universe that, even though strange, has its own visual coherence that remains interesting during hours of gameplay. The color palette is intense, and vivid contrasts make each planet and environment seem truly alien, but without falling into the obvious of being too dark or overly saturated. This style helps to give personality to the game and makes the experiences in its vast areas more memorable, even if they are not always the most technically refined. However, this same aesthetic choice brings a visual challenge. At times, the gigantic amount of elements on the screen, such as plants, lighting effects, and textures, combined with the explosion of colors and shines, can make it difficult to quickly interpret what is happening during combat or exploration. For me, this ends up creating a kind of visual noise that takes away some of the clarity of the gameplay, especially in more intense action scenes, where the focus should be absolute. Despite this, I find this kind of sacrifice acceptable because the dynamic and richly detailed atmosphere compensates, maintaining the sense of discovery and strangeness in a very alive universe. Speaking of technology, the game's graphics engine shows a clear evolution, with firm high-resolution textures, especially on faces and nearby objects, giving a stylized realism without pushing the hardware too much. The lighting effects are one of the most praised points, with dynamic shadows that create depth and help to highlight the volumes of the characters and the environment. For me, the lighting is almost a visual protagonist, as it greatly changes the mood of the levels and highlights the artistic work done on the textures of extraterrestrial surfaces and ship interiors. Even so, I cannot fail to notice that there is still some inconsistency in the quality of these shadows and volumetrics, which at certain moments seem less polished, something I imagine could be adjusted in updates. Another aspect that is evident is the refinement in facial animations, especially in pre-rendered scenes and dialogues, which have made reading emotions much more natural. For me, this greatly helps with immersion, since the game bases a good part of its charm and narrative on living and reactive characters. This graphic evolution in facial expressions and skin textures is a differential that adds a very positive touch to the experience, reinforcing Obsidian's commitment to creating a deeper emotional connection between the player and the characters. Although there are still limited options in facial creation, the visual result compensates. The design of the creatures, natural landscapes, and machines in the game maintains the same extremely inspired creative vein, which I consider a high point in this title. The visual detail, even if not hyper-realistic, is designed to make everything believable within the sci-fi universe. For me, this aesthetic coherence is fundamental to maintaining visual and narrative interest, especially in games that rely heavily on atmosphere. The feeling that remains is that each location was meticulously designed to tell a visual story, which is a credit to the art team. It is inevitable to compare this second title with its predecessor and with other modern RPGs that aim for ultra-realistic graphics. Despite not reaching the technical peak of these games, The Outer Worlds 2 manages to stand out precisely by not insisting on realism at all costs, choosing instead a visual direction that values atmosphere, artistic clarity, and its own identity. For me, this is a special strategic success, as it creates a differentiated and memorable visual experience that should age well and continue to be attractive to fans of the genre for years to come. First, let's talk about the minimum requirements that Obsidian announced. You'll need at least a GTX 1070 or RX 5700, an i5-8400 or Ryzen 5 2600 processor, and an incredible 16 gigabytes of RAM. This already shows that the game is considerably more demanding than the original, which ran even on very modest systems. The storage space has also increased a lot. It's 110 gigs for installation, which is a huge chunk of your SSD. This higher demand makes sense when you consider that the environments are larger. Mobility has been expanded with a double jump and slide, and the gunplay has been completely revamped to look more like a real modern FPS. The big question is, how did Obsidian optimize all this? Based on their history with the first game, which had very limited graphics settings but ran surprisingly stably, it seems they have maintained this philosophy of prioritizing stability over endless customization options. In the first Outer Worlds, adjustments like visual effects and shadows made the biggest difference in performance. Shadows alone could improve performance by 21% when set to low. The expectation is that The Outer Worlds 2 will follow this line, with some critical settings that really matter and others that are almost cosmetic. Now let's get to what really interests many people, how the game runs on PS5 and Xbox Series. This is where things get interesting, because Obsidian had a very traumatic experience with the Spacer's Choice Edition on next-gen consoles. That version was a complete technical disaster. The PS5 consistently ran worse than the Xboxes, with drops to 32 to 40 FPS in external combat, even in the 60 FPS performance mode. For The Outer Worlds 2, Obsidian clearly invested heavily in improving this. The game was developed with the current generation of consoles in mind as the baseline, not as a port or upgrade. This theoretically means that the engine is already optimized to take advantage of the PS5's ultra-fast SSD and the Series X's architecture from the start. The terrain streaming issue that caused those horrible stutters on Xbox should be resolved, as it was one of the main points of criticism from the community. But let's be realistic. We're talking about Obsidian, a studio that has always prioritized complex systems and narrative choices over absolute technical polish. One thing that has changed a lot since the first game is the expectation of graphics modes on consoles. The original Outer Worlds eventually got a 60 FPS patch for PS5 and Series X through backward compatibility, but it was kind of poorly done. In the Outer Worlds 2, the trend is that we will have a performance mode, 60 FPS with reduced graphics, and a quality mode, 30 FPS or maybe 40 FPS with maximized graphics, which has become the industry standard. Personally, I always recommend performance mode in first-person shooters. The difference in controller responsiveness and aiming is gigantic. Trying to land headshots at 30 FPS after experiencing 60 FPS is torture. What worries me a bit is that the game now has much more dynamic movement mechanics, sprint sliding, double jumping, parkouring through environments. These mechanics require a stable frame rate to work properly, otherwise you miss jumps. You can't chain movements and the whole experience is compromised. If the game has frequent drops to the 40-45 FPS range in performance mode, like the Spacer's Choice had, it's going to be extremely frustrating. Obsidian promised improved mobility across the board and larger environments for exploration, so I sincerely hope they have tested this exhaustively on consoles. One thing that drew a lot of negative attention in the Spacer's Choice edition was the complete absence of DLSS, FSR, and ray tracing. For a game released in 2023 to sell itself as a remaster, not having these technologies was pathetic. In the Outer Worlds 2, we still don't have official confirmation about ray tracing, which is concerning. DLSS and FSR have become essential for modern games to run well at high resolutions. They can literally double your performance while maintaining acceptable visual quality. If Obsidian repeats the mistake and doesn't include at least FSR, which works on all GPUs, it will be a gigantic shot in the foot. Dynamic resolution helps maintain a stable frame rate, but it doesn't replace a modern and well-implemented upscaling solution. The game runs on Unreal Engine and has support for DirectX 12, so technically there's no excuse for not including these features. But knowing Obsidian's history of focusing more on RPG systems than on cutting-edge graphics tech, I wouldn't be surprised if the game came vanilla without these technologies at launch and only got them later via a patch, if it gets them at all. I'll be honest, Obsidian has a problematic history with performance. The first Outer Worlds had stuttering, bad frame pacing, and frame drops on PC even with powerful hardware. The Spacer's Choice Edition was even worse, being called disappointing by Digital Foundry precisely for its dynamic and unstable performance. Players reported horrible performance even on high-end systems, and the game had micro-stuttering that only disappeared by disabling VSync and manually limiting it to 60 FPS. For the Outer Worlds 2, my expectation is for a game that will run well enough but won't be a technical showcase. We'll probably have some problems at launch, maybe stuttering in specific areas, maybe frame rate drops and very intense combat with lots of effects on the screen. Obsidian has always needed a few post-launch patches to polish performance. The important thing is that the problems are not game-breaking as they were in the Spacer's Choice. If the game maintains a stable 60 FPS most of the time on consoles in performance mode and runs consistently well on mid-range PCs that meet the recommended requirements, it will already be a considerable victory for the studio. At the end of the day, the Outer Worlds 2 seems to be a case of buy it if you're a fan, but wait for patches if you're sensitive to technical issues. The game will be on Game Pass day one, so if you have the subscription, it costs nothing to try it out and see how it runs on your specific setup. For those who are going to buy it at full price, I would honestly recommend waiting 2 or 3 weeks to see the community reports on performance, especially on the console you own. Obsidian always makes games with incredible systems, fantastic narratives, and fascinating worlds. But technical polish has never been their strong suit. If you have a PC in the range of the recommended requirements, or slightly above, you will probably have a good experience with some adjustments to the settings. If you have a PS5 or Series X, expect 60 FPS with some occasional drops in performance mode. And if you have a Series S, well, historically this version always suffers more in Obsidian's games, so adjust your expectations to possibly running at lower resolutions or with more graphical compromises. The important thing is that the game seems ambitious, expanded, and improved in all aspects of gameplay. I just hope the technology behind it can sustain this ambition without collapsing. Whether it's worth buying at launch depends a lot on your profile as a player and what you expect from the experience. For those who like RPGs with a lot of freedom of choice, sharp dialogues full of acid humor, and a mix of action and strategy, the game certainly delivers a robust and captivating experience. Great for those who enjoy delving into detailed worlds and decisions that impact the course of the story. Personally, I believe that The Outer Worlds 2 is a title that deserves to be played right at its debut if you are a fan of Obsidian RPGs and enjoy this sci-fi universe vibe with sharp social satire. The game promises a clear evolution from the original, with improved combat, more customization options, and more varied environments. For those who played and liked the first one, the launch brings that feeling of finally what was missing, with more depth and modern mechanics that can justify an immediate purchase. However, if you are the type who prefers to wait and see how the game performs at launch, if it will have bugs, what the public reception will be, and if the extra content will be justified, it's worth holding back your anxiety a bit. The launch on October 29 will already include some content like additional packages and early access for those who get the premium editions, but we will likely see patches and adjustments in the first few months, as is common in RPGs with big ambitions. As for the intended audience, The Outer Worlds 2 is focused on players who value narrative, choice, and consequence, and gameplay that blends stealth, combat, and dialogues with multiple options. It's for those who have the patience to explore, for those who like charismatic and well-built characters, and who are looking for an RPG with a great balance between humor, action, and an engaging story. If you prefer more linear and fast-paced games, you will probably find it lacking in rhythm or a more classic challenge. Another important point is the fact that the game is being released on platforms like PC, Xbox Series, and PlayStation 5, ensuring access to a good portion of the current audience. And for those who subscribe to Game Pass, the game's arrival on the platform saves the need to invest at launch, allowing you to try it without commitment, which is a trump card for those who are not sure if they want to invest right away. If you are already a fan of the Obsidian style, the space aesthetic, and the acid humor, the experience will be very rewarding from the start. For the more cautious, it is worth waiting for detailed reviews and a few months of updates to enjoy the game at its best. Therefore, the decision to buy now or later depends on your playing style and patience for any initial imperfections. But don't hesitate if this is the type of RPG that hooks you with its theme, narrative, and freedom of choice. The Outer Worlds 2 could be one of the most significant RPG releases of this year, especially for those who value these more personal and creative aspects that Obsidian knows how to offer so well.